It started with a letter, one that shouldn't have existed, one that should have been someone else's problem. I remember the day clearly. The sun had barely begun its descent behind the hills of my family's farm, casting golden rays over the fields that stretched endlessly in every direction. I had just finished my morning rounds, tending to the cattle and checking the irrigation system, when I noticed an envelope in my mailbox stamped with an official-looking seal. At first, I assumed it was a property tax notice or some other routine correspondence from the county, but as I ripped it open and scanned the words printed in bold letters across the top, my stomach tightened. Final notice of foreclosure, due to non-payment of HOA dues. The paper might as well have been a snake coiling in my hands. Homeowners Association? I didn't belong to an HOA. My farm had been in my family for generations, long before the nearby subdivision existed. There was no way some bureaucratic oversight could claim my land was under their control. Yet, the letter was clear. According to the so-called Fairfield Estates HOA, I owed them over $12,000 in unpaid dues and fines dating back 5 years. The letter claimed that, since I had failed to comply with multiple notices, none of which I had ever received, they were within their rights to initiate foreclosure proceedings. I clenched my jaw. This had to be a mistake. I spent the rest of the evening trying to calm myself down, convincing myself it was some clerical error. Maybe they had confused my address with someone else's. Maybe it was a scam. Either way, I wasn't going to let it ruin my night. But when I called the number listed on the notice the next morning, I realized just how real and how sinister this situation was. The voice on the other end was curt, almost dismissive. Fairfield Estates HOA, how can I help you? Yeah, I got a foreclosure notice in the mail, I said, gripping the phone tightly. There's been some mistake. I don't live in Fairfield Estates. I own a farm that's been in my family for over 60 years, and I've never been part of an HOA. There was a brief silence, followed by the clacking of a keyboard. Address? The woman asked. I gave it to her. More typing. Then a pause. You're listed as a property under our jurisdiction, she said matter-of-factly, as if that were the end of the discussion. What? No, I'm not, I said firmly. This property has never been part of an HOA. I have the original deeds. There's no record of this land being included in Fairfield Estates. Another pause. Then, with the same robotic indifference, she said, according to our records, your property was annexed into the HOA district 5 years ago. Dues have been accumulating since then. I felt my pulse pounding in my ears. Annex? I never agreed to that. Who gave you the authority to annex my farm into your HOA? You'll have to take that up with the board, she said. But as of now, your balance is overdue, and if payment is not made within 30 days, the foreclosure process will proceed. She hung up before I could get another word in. I stood there, gripping the phone so hard my knuckles turned white. This wasn't just a clerical error. This was an organized shakedown. I wasn't about to roll over. I drove straight to the county records office, determined to prove that my land had never been part of an HOA. The clerk, an older man who had worked there for decades, frowned as he pulled up my property records. He skimmed through the documents, his expression growing darker with each passing minute. This doesn't make sense, he muttered. Your farm has always been recorded as private, non-HOA land. But, he trailed off, pointing to a new document in the system. This was filed 5 years ago. It says your property was incorporated into the HOA through a territorial expansion. That's not possible, I said through gritted teeth. I never agreed to that. I never signed anything. The clerk nodded. I don't see a signature from you. That's strange. Normally, a property owner has to sign off on annexation. But this document was signed by the Fairfield Estates HOA board instead. I felt a surge of anger rise in my chest. They had done this behind my back, without my consent. They can't do this, can they? I asked. The clerk sighed. If it was improperly filed, it can be challenged. But they've been using this as justification for your dues. It's going to take a legal fight. A legal fight. Just what I needed. I left the records office with copies of everything, my hands shaking as I gripped the paperwork. This wasn't just an oversight. This was a deliberate attempt to claim my land under false pretenses. And if they had done it to me, how many others had they scammed? I wasn't just fighting for my farm anymore. I was fighting to expose whatever was going on behind closed doors. And I wasn't going to let them win. I had never been the kind of man to back down from a fight, especially when it came to my land. My family had worked this farm for generations, through droughts, floods, market crashes, and everything in between. There was no way I was going to let some power-hungry HOA take it away from me on the basis of fraudulent paperwork. The day after I discovered the bogus annexation in the county records, I knew I needed legal help. I wasn't an expert in property law, but I had a gut feeling this was going to be a long battle, and I'd be damned if I fought it unarmed. So I called up a local attorney, Mark Holloway, a man with a reputation for taking on tough property disputes. He was a no-nonsense kind of guy, and when I told him what had happened, he whistled low under his breath. "This isn't just some clerical error," he said, scanning through the documents I had handed him in his office. "This is a coordinated land grab, and if your property was fraudulently annexed, you're probably not the only one." That last part hit me hard. I had been so wrapped up in my own outrage that I hadn't stopped to consider the bigger picture. What if there were other landowners who had been roped into this HOA scam without realizing it? Mark leaned back in his chair, tapping a pen against his desk. "The first thing we need to do is file a formal dispute with the county and request an injunction to stop the foreclosure process. That'll buy us some time while we dig deeper into this. Have you spoken to any of your neighbors?" I shook my head. "Not yet, but I know some of the other farms near me have been around as long as mine. If they pulled this on me, they could have done it to them, too." Mark nodded. "Then let's start there. I'll handle the legal filings. You start knocking on doors." That night, I drove around to every property within a few miles of mine, speaking with other farmers and landowners. Most of them had never heard of Fairfield Estates HOA, let alone paid dues to them. But then I found Tom and Lisa Harper, a couple who own a small ranch just west of my property. As soon as I mentioned the HOA, Lisa's face turned pale. "They've been hounding us for years," she said, wringing her hands. "We got a notice just like yours a while back. We tried to fight it, but they threatened to take us to court. We didn't have the money for a legal battle, so we just started paying." Tom, a burly man with calloused hands, nodded grimly. "They claim we were annexed years ago, but we never agreed to it. I don't know how they got away with it." I clenched my fists. If the HOA had been forcing people into compliance through intimidation and false legal claims, they had been running the scam for a long time. The next morning, I took what I had learned back to Mark. "This just got a whole lot bigger," I told him. "They've been bullying people into paying for years. If we can prove they expanded their jurisdiction illegally, we might have a case for fraud." Mark's expression hardened. "Then we need to dig into the HOA's records. If they forged annexation documents for your property, they could have done the same to dozens of others." With that, we filed our first legal action, a formal challenge to the foreclosure, citing fraudulent annexation. But I knew that wouldn't be enough. We needed proof that this was a systemic problem, not just a one-off error. So I started doing some digging of my own. I attended one of Fairfield Estates HOA's public meetings, pretending to be a new homeowner interested in the community. What I saw confirmed my worst suspicions. The board members ran the place like a mafia. The president, a slick-looking guy named Darren Pierce, spoke with a level of arrogance that made my blood boil. He talked about increasing revenue streams and maximizing community growth. But the more he talked, the clearer it became that they were using their authority to manipulate property lines in their favor. After the meeting, I managed to corner one of the junior board members, a nervous-looking man named Greg. With a little friendly pressure, he let slip that the HOA had been quietly adjusting their boundaries for years, targeting properties they thought could bring in extra income. I asked him point-blank, How do you annex a property without the owner's consent? He hesitated, then muttered, They tell the county it was a clerical error. File the paperwork retroactively. By the time anyone notices, the dues have been piling up, and they either pay or they lose their property. My stomach twisted. This wasn't just shady, it was outright fraud. Armed with that information, I went back to Mark. They've been rigging the system, I told him, and we can prove it. Mark wasted no time filing additional complaints. He subpoenaed the HOA's financial records, their board meeting notes, and any paperwork related to annexation over the past decade. The more we dug, the more corruption we found. Some of the annexations had been rubber-stamped by county officials who had close ties to the HOA. Others were backed by mysteriously missing documents. Owners who supposedly signed away their rights, but whose signatures were nowhere to be found. The case started gaining traction, and soon it wasn't just us fighting back. More landowners came forward, sharing similar stories of coercion and illegal property claims. The local news picked up the story, and suddenly Fairfield Estates HOA was in the hot seat. But the HOA wasn't going down without a fight. A week after the first news report aired, I found a notice nailed to my front gate. Cease and desist. They were trying to silence me. That same night, a black SUV parked at the end of my driveway for hours, its headlights off. When I stepped outside with my rifle, it peeled away into the darkness. I knew then that we were getting too close to something big, but I wasn't going to let fear stop me. I met with Mark the next morning. We've got them rattled, I said. Now let's finish this. He nodded, pushing a thick stack of documents across his desk. Then it's time to take them to court. The battle was just beginning, but I wasn't backing down. I had come too far, and there was too much at stake. This wasn't just about my farm anymore. It was about every landowner they had tried to cheat, every family they had bullied, every dollar they had stolen. It was time to make them pay. The fight was far from over. If anything, things were only getting more intense. The HOA had tried intimidation, bureaucracy, and legal threats, but I had no plans of backing down. After our legal filings, things started to move fast. Mark Holloway, my lawyer, had successfully secured an injunction that temporarily stopped the foreclosure. But that was just the first battle. We needed to prove not only that my farm had been fraudulently annexed, but that Fairfield Estates HOA had been running the scam on multiple landowners. If we won, it wouldn't just be about saving my farm. It could dismantle the entire corrupt operation. But the HOA wasn't just going to roll over. A week after our injunction was granted, I received another letter. This one was different. It was from the HOA's attorneys, and it was a direct warning. Your claims against Fairfield Estates Homeowners Association are baseless and defamatory. Should you persist with legal action, you will be held liable for damages resulting from slander and unlawful interference with HOA operations. I stared at the letter, my grip tightening. They were trying to scare me into backing off, but I had already come too far to turn around now. When I showed it to Mark, he chuckled. They're bluffing, he said, shaking his head. This is a classic scare tactic. If they had a legitimate claim, they'd be pursuing it in court already. Instead, they're hoping to intimidate you. They're also stalling, I said. They know if this case drags out long enough, I might run out of money to keep fighting. Mark nodded. That's why we need to move aggressively. I've filed for full discovery. If we get access to their financial records, I guarantee we'll find the proof we need. A few days later, we got a breakthrough. The court granted us access to the HOA's financial and property records, but not before the HOA's lawyers tried to block it, arguing that their financial documents were confidential. The judge disagreed. If they had been annexing properties legally, they had nothing to hide. What we found confirmed everything I had suspected. Mark's paralegal, a sharp-eyed young woman named Rachel, went through the records first. She found clear evidence that the HOA had been fraudulently expanding their borders, adding properties like mine without consent. In many cases, They had forged signatures or cited outdated property maps to justify annexations. Even worse, they had been issuing fines and fees to non-HOA members, then threatening foreclosure when those people didn't pay. But the biggest bombshell was buried deep in their financial reports. There were massive, unexplained transactions, hundreds of thousands of dollars in fees collected from property owners who had been forced into the HOA. Some of that money had been funneled into private accounts belonging to HOA board members. In other words, this wasn't just a land grab, it was a racket. "This is fraud," Mark said, looking at the numbers. "This isn't just a civil case anymore. This could turn into a criminal investigation." Armed with this evidence, we went on the offensive. Mark filed a motion to have the foreclosure case against me dismissed entirely, citing fraud and unlawful annexation. At the same time, he contacted the state's attorney general's office, providing them with the financial documents and requesting an investigation into Fairfield Estates HOA. And then, things got really ugly. The night after we filed, I woke up to the sound of barking dogs. I grabbed my shotgun and went outside. The air was thick and still, but something felt off. I moved toward my barn, and that's when I saw it. The side of my barn was on fire. I ran toward the flames, my heart pounding. I grabbed the nearest hose and started spraying, yelling for my farmhand Javier to get the water pump running. The fire spread fast, but we managed to contain it before it reached the main structure. Still, the damage was done. Half the barn was blackened, and I lost a good amount of stored feed and equipment. This wasn't an accident. Someone had set this fire. Javier found a gas can near the fence line, proof that it had been intentional. I called the sheriff's department, and they sent a deputy out. But I knew how these things went. Without direct proof, they wouldn't be able to do much. "Do you have any enemies?" the deputy asked. I let out a dry laugh. "Yeah, about 6 people sitting on the HOA board." I knew this was retaliation for what we had uncovered. They were trying to send a message. But all they did was make me even more determined to see this through. The next morning, I went straight to the courthouse and filed my own lawsuit against Fairfield Estates HOA. I wasn't just fighting their foreclosure anymore. I was suing them for fraud, property damage, and harassment. And I wasn't alone. Over a dozen other landowners joined me. Tom and Lisa Harper, the couple who had been bullied into paying fake dues for years, were the first to sign on. Then more people came forward. Farmers, ranchers, even a few homeowners who had been forced into the HOA's control against their will. The pressure was mounting, and the media was eating it up. Local news stations ran stories on our case, interviewing victims of the HOA's fraud. The more attention we got, the harder it became for them to hide. And then the state attorney general's office stepped in. They launched a formal investigation into Fairfield Estates HOA, seizing their financial records and freezing their accounts. Board members were subpoenaed, and the more they dug, the worse it got. It turned out that the corruption ran deeper than we thought. The HOA had been bribing county officials to approve illegal annexations. They had been forging documents, threatening landowners, and even skimming money into offshore accounts. The whole operation was coming down. It took months, but in the end, we won. The court ruled in our favor, officially declaring my farm and all the other illegally annexed properties exempt from the HOA's jurisdiction. The foreclosure against me was dismissed, and the HOA was ordered to pay damages. But the biggest victory came when the board members were arrested on fraud and racketeering charges. Darren Pierce, the HOA president, tried to skip town, but the feds caught up with him. He ended up facing multiple felony charges, along with several other board members. When the dust settled, Fairfield Estates HOA was dissolved completely. It was over. I stood on my porch the morning after the final ruling, looking out at my land, the land they had tried to take from me. The barn was still scarred from the fire, but it would be rebuilt. The important thing was that the farm was still mine. The fight had cost me months of stress, sleepless nights, and more money than I wanted to think about. But I had won, and in the process, I had helped stop a corrupt system from preying on more people like me. Standing there, feeling the sun on my face, I knew one thing for certain. No one was ever going to take my land from me again,